Our next speaker is a highly skilled linguist, audio-visual translator, and literary translator and educator, delving into the critical aspects of working effectively with interpreters. And she'll also address the ethical considerations when working with interpreters, shedding light on the importance of maintaining cultural sensitivity and respect. Welcome, Barbara Ricci. Welcome, Barbara.
Hi, thank you very much. It was really, really interesting today. So I'm really glad to see lots of people very passionate about what we're doing. It was really interesting what Sana was saying as humanitarian interpreters. There's lots of things that I was thinking about talking that have been already said. So I'm going to change and improvise a bit and sort of get everything together, what has been said, because we talked a lot about standards of practice. So I took notes of what everyone said. And I would like to say that my presentation was supposed to be about public service interpreting. And when I first arrived here, it was like 7 years ago, I have a degree as a translator and interpreter, and I work as you said before, as audiovisual translator, as an interpreter, simultaneous interpreter. I was really impressed by the fact that, there were public service interpreters that play a critical role for to create equal access to essential services. So when you don't speak the language of a country you live in, if you can be cut out from lots of essential services. And obviously, public service interpreters help to bridge this gap, linguistic and cultural. However, for this to be an effective service, there needs to be a collaboration and understanding of the role, in collaboration with both service users, so the clients that access services, and service providers, which can be the NHS, it can be schools, it can be, as we seen before, courts. I realized working as a public service interpreter that sometimes the role we have is not very clear, it's not understood. So as Andrea was saying before, it's very important, for example, to introduce ourselves when we start an assignment, because so we set the rules and we sort of clarify what our role is. I also realized that lots of service users, so people who don't speak the language of the country they live in, are not aware of the fact that they can request an interpreter always to access public services. It's their right to have an interpreter. And it's actually much better for them to express their thoughts and their ideas and their concerns if it's medical assignment, if it's a medical meeting, in their own language. I interpret a lot in mental health care. It does make a difference when you can express yourself in your own language rather than in a language you don't feel you're proficient. And also realize that service provider are sometimes not very proactive in offering interpreting services because they have to pay. They don't have rate for qualified interpreters. Mike was saying it's very important to have quality of interpretation because it does impact on the effectiveness of the service delivered. And it also, unfortunately, impact on the life and death of service users, as we've seen before. So standards of practice need to be high. What are the things to take into consideration when we choose a public service interpreter? As we said, as some of you said before, it's very important to identify the language. So as who was saying it? I mean, I think most of you said it. There are languages and there are dialects. So, for example, Sanya was saying in Arab, there are different dialects. So when we choose an interpreter, determine the language required or languages required. The interpreter needs to be fluent both in the source and the target language, but also if there is a dialect, it needs to understand the dialect. For example, once I was called, so don't assume that the person nationality or country of origin means that they speak the language of the country. I was saying I was once called for an interpreting session, and I arrived there and the person spoke Portuguese. I am Italian. I know Spanish and Portuguese, but I don't interpret for Spanish and Portuguese because all the cultural nuances get lost with me. And I said, well, I'm really sorry. I don't know what happened here. How come they called an Italian interpreter for a Portuguese? Then I realized, talking to the service user, that she was born in Italy. Her mum was Italian. So probably what they asked is, where are you born? What's your mother tongue? And she thought, oh, my mum's language is Italian. And then they booked in Italian. So be sure that the language that the service provider, the service user speak is the one you are booking the interpreter for, that the interpreter has experience, and as we said up to now, that they have professional and ethical standards, which means that they maintain confidentiality. There's lots of sensitive issues and lots of data, personal data that are shared, that they're impartial, they don't take sides, so they're not there to advocate, they're there to promote communicative autonomy, which means that everything that is said is translated in the first person so that the voice of the person is stronger as well. And nothing is added, nothing is changed, nothing is omitted, so it's all accurate. When booking an interpreter, there's lots of things that service provider needs to be aware of. As Sue, I think, was saying at the beginning, when and where to meet. I once went into the hospital. It was a huge hospital. There were 3 receptions. Where do I go? There's not explained back well where you need to meet. Sometimes it's a private home. You need to specify if it's a private home so that I know that when I get there, I don't knock on the door, because I know that I don't need to, I can't, for ethical issues, meet the service user before the service provider arrive. Who to contact in case of emergencies, who is the person that we need to report to when we arrive, and any necessary background information are also useful. Brief the interpreter as a service provider when you arrive so that you know a bit of background information, and if there is any specific terminology or jargon that is going to be used during the assignment. Another thing that I noticed when working as an interpreter is that people tend to talk to you. So, like, instead of talking directly to the person, they tend to talk to you. Can you please explain this to the person? It's not for us to have a relationship directly with the service user, but we sort of make it happen that the service user and the service provider talk to each other directly. That's what is direct communication. And that's why we use the first person. As Sana was saying, there's lots of using of technology, especially after COVID happened. Now everyone is booking interpreters on remotely, on the phone, on the video. And, you can't have a physiotherapy on the phone because it becomes really complicated to explain. So raise your left hand. Is he raising his left leg? Or I don't know, for schools or for NHS, to save money, sometimes they don't take into consideration that actually the persons on the other side might not feel at ease to talk, because it's not very easy to have an appointment, NHS appointment, on the phone with an interpreter. Sometimes people might find it really difficult to talk to through an interpreter. So as interpreters, we need to be aware that they need to feel comfortable, because they might be embarrassed or intimidated to express themselves to an interpreter. There's also to keep in mind that some people prefer to have an interpreter same sex, because there might be some conversation around, I don't know, things that they don't want to talk through a man if they're female. Men sometimes prefer to have female as interpreter. And the main thing which I notice sometimes to save money is to use interpreters that are family members or friends or children when in schools, which is like a big no-no for lots of different reasons. First of all, they're not trained interpreter. The professional standards cannot be ensured. They don't abide to a code of ethics that interpreters do. And it can be very traumatic for them to interpret for family members. And for family members, it's very embarrassing to express themselves to a friend or family members, which is more or less what we've been talking about today. So how important it is for interpreters, public service interpreting, I'm talking about, but humanitarian interpreters, Sana was saying, to be recognized as professionals. So to abide to a code of practice. I teach community interpreting up to level 6, and I know that some of my students from level 2 are working. I'm really happy for them, but I feel they're not ready to be out there and work as interpreters with a level 2. And it's unfortunately agencies, because they prefer to spend less money to pay interpreters less, they get people who are not highly qualified, and it's a shame, because then the services are suffering, and our role becomes less important and less recognized as it should be. Another thing that I wanted to add, we said about the technology. I'm just looking at the, yes, as Sana was saying, we always need, we can sometimes deal with very traumatizing assignments, especially you, Sana, I imagine. But even for mental health, we all translate in the first person. So be aware that we can have vicarious trauma. So if we are interpreting for a person using the first person, and some of the content of what we translate can be traumatizing for us, as a service provider, do take some minutes to talk to us after and check if we are okay. That's it. Thank you. I hope I didn't bore you, because lots of
No,
things were
absolutely.
already said before.
No, Barbara, thank you for highlighting those very important points. We have a question. Actually, we have one of our audience members, Hiba Aldwikat. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Hiba, lovely to have you join us. Basically, you have posed a question that I was going to ask, so I'm going to merge both the questions and put that to Barbara. So Hiba wants to raise and expand on what Sana said around body language. And what she's saying, what she's asking rather, is in terms of translation and interpretation, how can we transfer the meaning of facial expression and body language between different clients, cultures? So body language plays a really important part, as well as, you know, the voice verbal communication, more than we more than likely realize. And the gestures that are common and appropriate in one culture may not be in another. So I was just wondering how interpreters address this. So I was just wondering if you could, you know, expand on this for us.
Yeah, definitely, Hiba. This is a very good question. Yeah. So body language is very important. That's why we don't want to have remote interpreting on the phone, because we cannot see the person. We cannot see how they express their body, their faces as well. As you would say, Samina, there are cultural differences. So that's why an interpreter needs to be culturally aware. So I know Spanish better than English. I don't work with Spanish because I don't know all the cultural nuances of that language. I don't know all the cultural nuances of South America and Spain. So I tend to, no, I translate and I interpret just for Italian, because all these cultural nuances or body language things get lost in translation. So the tone of of what is said, the facial expression, we do repeat them as well when we interpret. So if the tone, if she is expressing distress in the tone or in the face, we do express the same in the tone and the face, so that the language sort of fluidly, the body language as well, sort of fluidly pass through. I hope I answered.
Yeah, no, thank you. And yeah, that's really interesting. I have another question based on
Yeah.
something that you said, and it's kind of been mentioned throughout the event around agencies employing or, you know, adopting the services of cheap interpreters. Now, it's not always agencies, is it? Because clients can request a certain price point and so on. So I was just wondering what that interconnectivity is, because agencies can't always be blamed for that, surely.
No.
It's, yeah, so I was wondering if you could just respond to that.
So I think for vulnerable clients, they need to have access to an interpreter for free. That's my personal opinion. So if a vulnerable client who cannot pay for the services, these should be offered for free. So there should be funding, it should be regulated, it should be understood the importance of having an interpreter in lots of situations to access services. So services should be funded to have access to interpreting services, especially for vulnerable people who cannot pay an interpreter. So for it to be accessible to all. Obviously, this is a profession for us, and it is
Yeah.
not a consistent profession. We are almost always casual interpreters. So I teach languages, I teach at the university at the moment, but I always had another job along what I'm doing as an interpreter, because you cannot live as an interpreter full time. So that it needs to be recognized as well. We need to be paid because we are not regulated as as interpreters. We need to be paid a right amount of money, which needs to be at least £25 an hour. We need to be paid if we move somewhere from A to B by car. We need to be paid all the expenses as well. So vulnerable people should have access to this service for free. Agencies should try and get funding as much as possible. NHS and police and all the services should get funding for this service, because I think it's crucial for the
I
well-being of people.
Yeah, I think you make a valid point, but here's the thing. It's about the quality of interpretation being provided as well. And I think
Yeah.
that's what I was, that's what was kind of been alluded to throughout the event, is like, yes, people should be paid fair remuneration, as Mike already said, but it's about having that quality of interpretation, and that's what you pay for. But Barbara, thank you so much for the
Thank
insights.
you.
It's
Thank
been
you very much.
fascinating to listen to you and all our other speakers so far. Thank you.